Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi. Today, I am joined by Dr. Gary Habermas, and we're looking at some new evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. It's going to be a really exciting episode because I don't even know what he's talking about. I don't know what this new evidence is. He's actually just going to reveal it here live on the streams. My first time hearing it, so I'm just super excited. And instead of do like a long, drawn-out intro on Dr. Gary Habermas, he's a historian. He's a philosopher. If you'd like to learn more about him, check the description of this video. But let's just jump. I want to jump right in because we've only got about an hour to go over this evidence. So let's just jump right in. Gary, where should we start? What's this new evidence that you've got?
Well, a lot of people know I've been working on what I call magnum opus. That's a long story, but briefly, a bunch of my buddies told me 10 years ago or more I should start doing a major work on the resurrection that does not borrow from my 20-something books of my 50% of what I've written is on the resurrection. So they said, why don't you do something new and put all this stuff out there? And I just trashed the whole idea because I told them it would take the rest of my life and I've got things going on. And so they said, well, start. Well, I thought, and I got working on it. Well, we're getting ready, finishing the first volume. And it is 1,600 pages on just the evidence for Christianity, the evidence for the resurrection. And it is the first of 4 volumes. And in the process, it occurred to me that some things were happening, and I was realizing some research that hadn't been talked much about before. Now, some of the things I'm talking about will be familiar to people, but I think it's the arrangement of them that's really new. So let me say it this way. When you want to do history, there are a lot of tools you need. I say there are tools and rules. There's things you use and how you apply them. And 2 of the most important ones are eyewitness testimony and early testimony. And a lot of critics think we have neither. A lot of critics who deny the 4 Gospels. Paul, they like Paul. They'll admit about half of Paul's books, and you're free to use those half of books. A lot of people misunderstand. They think you can't use the scripture with atheist New Testament professors. Not true. But they limit what you can use, according to their view. And so I started working with their principles. And what came out was the argument I called the minimal facts argument. And the minimal facts argument says I can take the facts that the critics allow and have enough of a basis to show that Jesus was raised from the dead. Well, as I'm getting done with this first volume on evidence, it occurred to me that there are 6, actually 5, a quick one afterwards, but there's 5 lines of evidence that all are manifest on or before 36 AD. Now, let me explain that for a second. If you ask a Christian, what kind of evidence do we have? They'll say, well, let's start with Mark. Let's move to Matthew. If you want to go by the year, what date critics put him at. Let's go to Luke. Let's go to John. John's probably too late. Try to stick with Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And that's kind of the way the conversation proceeds. But the critics also like Paul. And when you start unpacking some of this stuff, you get further and further and further back. For example, John is about 95 AD. If Jesus died in 30 AD, that's plus 65. According to critics' dating, Luke is about plus 55. Matthew is about 50. Mark's the youngest at about 70 AD or plus 40. But Paul's first epistle is probably 1 Thessalonians in 50 AD. Some go as early as 48 for 1 Thessalonians. That makes 1 Thessalonians 18 to 20 years after the cross. Cuts the distance with Mark in half. And when Paul starts talking, he doesn't sit there and start explaining and defining things for the Thessalonians. I mean, Cameron, this is new stuff to the Thessalonians. Shouldn't Paul be telling them? Now, when I say Son of God, I mean, and give a definition. When I say Messiah, that's a Jewish word. Greek speakers say Christ, and that means this. And when we call Jesus Lord, that means this, but he doesn't do that. He opens 1 Thessalonians with a loaded Christology. Everybody admits this. He uses all the heaviest names for Jesus and doesn't explain them. So that's interesting. At plus 18 to plus 20, he's using terms that they probably know a lot about before he writes the letter to them. So that's earlier than 1 Thessalonians. Okay. Now let me back up from the other end. Am I making sense so far?
Yep.
Should I slow down on any of this?
No, it's good. Yeah, just keep going.
Straightforward?
I'll slow you down if we need to.
Yeah, do that, because I don't want to just ramble on and assume that you're being a nice guy and not going to interrupt me, which I prefer you to do. Okay, let's go from the other end. I ended up with Thessalonians at probably 50 AD, but it could be 48. That's only 18 to 20 years after the cross, half the distance of Mark. Now let's go back to the cross. Moving forward, everybody puts the conversion of Paul at plus 2 or 3. That's 32 to 33. If you keep the cross at 30 in your mind. Some people say 33 for the cross, but all you're going to do is move your numbers up. And at 33, you're going to be even closer to the book of 1 Thessalonians. But at 30, Paul comes to the Lord. He's taking his trip to Damascus at 32 to 33. Here's the big question we start with today. What is going on between 30 and 32? Or if you prefer, 33. What is going on in the Christian world before Paul comes to know Jesus? Now, the normal comment is, well, Paul was a Pharisee. Good. He was a scholar. Yep. And he was angry about something. He held the coats of those who stoned Stephen. We're told that Paul voted against the Christians he caught. He voted against them. The phrase is, unto their death. So he voted, I guess if he was a jury member, quote unquote, he voted for him to die. That's going on between 30 and 33. That's Paul's side. He didn't like what he was hearing. But now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty. What was Paul hearing? What was out there between 30 and 33? And again, our point is we want early eyewitnesses. There aren't any Gospels, and Paul's written no books. Now, the earliest Christian preaching, according to skeptics like Gerrit Ludemann, the late Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist German New Testament scholar, Bart Ehrman, and many others, the preaching of Christianity started immediately. Christians began preaching the gospel immediately. So right away, if Jesus dies in the spring of 30 AD, and Christians are preaching the gospel, which at a minimum is the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus, what is making Paul so angry? And I guess that kind of general question kind of sets the stage for this. And take Gerrit Ludemann, the atheist New Testament scholar. He says Christians preach the gospel data immediately after. He doesn't believe in an ascension. So immediately after they didn't see Jesus anymore, the book of Acts says 50 days later, Pentecost. So less than 2 months later, they're out preaching. And Ludemann says that's true. Christians were preaching the gospel at about, what's immediately. But according to Acts, it's 2 months later. Now, this is a very exciting time. I'll just stop right there for 1 second. The old view among both liberals and non-liberals, both conservatives and liberals, is that a lot of scholars think that it got to the book of John before we totally unpacked how heavy Jesus' Christology was. Whether you like John or not, John is saying he's developing what they said in the early church. But Cameron, this is surprise number one. I'm not putting on the timeline yet, but just a point. A lot of critics are saying today that what came out of the gates in 30 AD, what came out of the Christians' mouths, what Gerrit Ludemann calls early, immediate, is the highest Christology ever preached. Now let's just think about that for a second. The old view is John unpacked it 60 years later. The new view is at least as heavy as what John did, was coming out of the gate immediately. Okay, what are some of the things that come immediately? Let me use Richard Bauckham. He's probably very well known with your well-read folks that listen to your broadcasts. And Bauckham did not invent this phrase, but he quoted it. And here's the phrase. And no matter how often I say this, I am blown up by this stuff. It's incredible. Here's the phrase. The earliest Christology is the highest Christology. Go, whoa. I don't think that can happen. They can't come out of the gate blasting like with a cannon and all this heavy Christology. How do you know that?
Okay, so I want to situate the audience a little bit. If they don't know the term high Christology, what does that mean? Because I think that's important for this first point.
That's a great question. And I love you stopping me like that because I want people to understand this. This is a powerful message. High Christology, the way I'm using it, is a very lofty Christology. Jesus is not just a Galilean preacher who some people misunderstood. Some people got him right. Some got him wrong. Some hated him. Some loved him. He did a lot of miracles. He did exorcisms. And darn it, the Romans killed him, but he was raised from the dead. That's the way we do it. And you would think it took a long time for it to get into Christians' heads what this panorama was about. Does that make sense? You'd think they would have
sorry, so that I'm following correctly, were you just describing low Christology?
Yes, I was just going to say, okay. That's great. I was just going to say, most people would think beginning Christology was at least lower, and it took up until Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John to unpack it. And John, in the beginning was the Word was God, the Word was with God. Thomas says, my Lord and my God, and he worships him. Wow, 60 years. In fact, Raymond Brown, the very well-known, until he passed away in the 90s, very well-known, probably the best-known American New Testament scholar, said something like this. If Jesus had returned in 100 AD, this is the old view, if Jesus had returned in 100 AD and read the Gospel of John, he would have said, yeah, that's exactly where I was going. Thank you, John. But the idea is it took 60 years to get there. And the people coming out of the gate in 30 AD, they were struggling. This is the old view. They were struggling to know exactly who Jesus was. I mean, after all, Peter denies him. The disciples were told they doubted when they saw him. When the women go to the empty tomb and they come back and tell the disciples in Luke 24, they thought the women were spreading gossip, it says in Luke 24:11. That's the old view. Christians had a good view of Jesus, but they were struggling to say to themselves, who was this guy? That's low Christology, and it took a long time to unpack it. High Christology is it came shooting out of a cannon, who knows where from, and everything came out of first.
Everything in terms of like Jesus was son. Would you say that like the Trinity, not necessarily like the full blown Trinity, but like Jesus is God? Would you say that that's part of high Christology?
Let's do a little bit of that. You know what? I got a chart right here. Just let me grab it. Make sure.
Okay. Feel free.
I'm doing justice. Here it is. Let's make sure I'm doing justice. In the earliest materials, he's called Christ, Son of God, and Lord. He's also said, Cameron, to be of God's nature. It's also said that he's going to be sitting on the right hand of God. And it says that he's pre-existent. Before Mary bore him, he had already been in existence. All that stuff comes out of the canon from the get-go. Messiah, Son of God, Lord, which a lot of people think is the loftiest of all terms, that Lord is even loftier than the title God, because Lord is Lord in caps. If you have one of those Bibles where in the Old Testament, whenever it says the name Lord, it's all in caps, that's
Mm-hmm.
Jehovah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So when Christians used the Old Testament concept, Lord, by the four, caps, they were kind of close to calling him Jehovah. That's bombastic. And no, wait a minute. They go,
It's not
wait,
just
let's
like
get the picture.
master. It'd be Jehovah. Wow. Okay.
Well, I'll tell you how they know it's that I'll tell you how they know from the beginning. They called him Jehovah. That's Richard Bauckham, the very well-known New Testament scholar, British. Um,
Well, let me.
Bauckham's big. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to bring us back to this piece of evidence that you're looking at right now, which is there's this time right after Jesus' death between, and you say it could range from like 30 to 33. That doesn't really matter. But the question is, what was happening during that time that Paul, before his conversion, after Jesus died, what was going on during those 3 years? And that's what you're sort of drawing attention to is like, what is it, like, what was causing such a ruckus, basically? And so the old view is that, that you've got this low Christology view where Jesus was more or less just a Galilean guy, this rando who was killed because of his, blasphemous claims or whatever, but he wasn't like anything special. But now where it seems like you talked about Gerrit Ludemann earlier, and he's leaning toward this high Christology view during these few years right after Jesus' death, because that's going to help explain why there was so much turmoil in the land right after Jesus' death.
Why everything came shot out of a cannon in between the crucifixion and Paul's conversion. But just a couple of points to make. Gerrit Ludemann doesn't hold these things. He doesn't believe Jesus was the Son of God.
Right.
But Ludemann is unpacking what Christians believed about him. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. And secondly,
that's a good distinction.
Yeah, I'm sure there's some people who had really low views of Jesus. Like you said, yeah, he's some Galilean preacher. I think he's a prophet of some sort. He reminds me of this guy or this guy, and they name old prophets. No, even before he died, people were thinking he's the Son of God. He made that claim. In fact, if you buy Mark 14, 61 to 64, which I think is the highest Christology in the Gospels, the high priest asks him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" He says, "Ego me, I am. And henceforth you'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds." And when he says he's the Son of Man, the priest tears his garments because he declares him a blasphemer. So there was some high Christology there, but I don't think in the low stage. But I don't think people had unpacked it. They're going like, remember when he went back to his hometown? Isn't he the son of Mary? Answer, yep. Didn't he grow up here? Yep. Then however lofty he is, he's a man. Yep. But some people are saying he's the Son of God. Yeah, they're crazy. And it said he couldn't do miracles in his own town. There were some people before he died, of course, who thought he was the Son of God, who thought he was Lord, and they had a fairly high Christology. But even there, they don't unpack it. But we have this odd phenomena that John's got this real high Christology way down there at plus 65 in Raymond Brown. If Jesus had come back, Jesus would probably say, yep, John got it right, but he's the disciple I loved. So I'm not surprised John pulled the rabbit out of the hat. But that's not, well, let's go back to it. Go ahead.
Yeah, I've got a couple objections to this line of reasoning. So first of all, why do we need to posit a high Christology in order to explain all the turmoil that was going on, and why Paul was why he was persecuting Christians, so to speak, and sort of getting riled up by them, like having to go out and take care of them, so to speak? Like, why do we need to posit a high Christology during that time? Couldn't we just posit, we'd have to just maybe think up some reason why the Christians were being so rambunctious, but that doesn't seem too difficult of a task. So that's one response. And then the other objection that I've got is, well, how does this actually support the resurrection of Jesus? Because, a lot of people believed really crazy things about other false prophets. Islam, Christianity is true, Islam's false. So that's another case of where you could see that just because someone's got a belief and is very convinced of something, that doesn't necessarily support the view in question. So those are kind of two objections that popped up in my mind as you were going there. So how would you address those?
Yep. Well, your first question, where does this come from, and how do we know they were doing this? I haven't given the 5 things yet. I'll give you the
Oh,
5 lines which show you where I'm only setting the stage and saying
oh
what
wow.
they were proclaiming was the highest stuff, but I'm going to answer your question. How do we know they were proclaiming this high Christology from the very beginning? I'm going to give 5 reasons to know it happened by 36 AD. It was already unpacked. What I mean is they knew it from the very beginning, but we see 5 evidences. Here's another way to say it. We don't have to wait for Mark in 70 AD. We don't even have to wait for First Thessalonians in 50 AD, where it's high Christology and it's never explained. So they already believed it in Thessalonica, First Thessalonians. How did they get that far that fast? So I went all the way back to the cross and I said, here's what's coming out of the canon. All right, I've got 5 indications that tell us here's how it happened. But I was setting the stage by saying, if the earliest Christology is the highest Christology, like your first question just asked, I want to know what the data are that they got it back then and did not have to wait until John's Gospel. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
let me
fair
go ahead
enough. I'm excited to hear the 5. What about the
well,
second
so I don't,
objection? Do
so
you
I
want to
don't,
address that later after we look at the 5?
I'll start it right. I could start right now, but the main point I wanted to get across for the opening intro is that there was a very high proclamation of Jesus going around from the beginning. Right now I'm only making a statement, then I'll give the evidence for it. They called him pre-existent. These 3 things are highly blasphemous. He's pre-existent. He's of the nature of God, and he's seated on God's right hand on the throne. Some New Testament scholars think that was the most blasphemous claim, that he was fit, that it wasn't heresy for him to share God's throne, which he declares in Mark 14:61 to 63, the high priest, and he tears his garment and off to the crucifixion we go. All right. That the claim is, all right, dude, if you can show me that they thought he was pre-existent, of the nature of God, and shared the throne with God, you're going to get my attention and you're going to cause me to realize the earliest Christology, the highest Christology, but I don't see any evidence of this yet. I just hear you talking. Is that good?
Yeah. All right, yeah,
Okay.
let's get into it. So, and we're already about 30 minutes in as well, and that was just the intro. So, hopefully,
I can do
we've only got
I
an
can do
hour
the,
with you.
I know I can do the 5 real fast though. I can put the 5 down in 5 minutes if I had to. But
Okay.
here's the
Yeah,
5.
do it. Just take your time. I'm gonna shut up. I'm gonna let you go.
Okay. Um, the the earliest proclamation that Garrett Ludeman says was there from the beginning. That proclamation was of these things. They taught the things I just said in this introduction. They were saying he's the Son of God, he's on the right hand of God, he's of the nature of God, and this was taught right there before it even got to Paul's conversion. Paul is upset for some reason. Paul's got a right to be upset. The Christians were proclaiming some things that were highly blasphemous to Paul's way of thinking. And the first step is the preaching they were doing. We know this happened from the very beginning. Now, the Greek word, it's a New Testament word, and it's called homologia. And the word means things which are to be believed among us, the center of our faith, what we agree on. In the New Testament, that's called homologia, Greek word, in the New Testament. And that is their preaching. Okay, second step. How do we know they were preaching that? I can say that. How do we know they're preaching? Second step. Cameron, we've talked before about the early creeds in the New Testament, and these are very, very early. The early creeds, these are little snippets of information that are found in our epistles. Now, if you unpack them, what do you get? This is stage 2. The second one is the early Christian preaching. They preached it. Now, I haven't answered the question yet, what's their evidence? But they preached it. Second, but the question is, how do we know they preached this heavy, heavy Christology from the beginning? Because the early creeds say so. And we know they're early. Critics date these things to the 30s. Critics do. Bart Ehrman, atheist New Testament scholar. Bart Ehrman says over and over and over that they're in the 30s. Sometimes he says they happened in these creeds were out in the first 2 years after the crucifixion. First 2 years. What do they proclaim? Let's talk about a few of them. And the critics agree where these creeds are. Here's one. Romans 10:9. If we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in our heart that God's raised him from the dead, we'll be saved. If we confess with our mouth that Jesus is Lord and
Is that the
believe in the
Jehovah Lord?
resurrection, okay, that's how you know. This is Romans 10:9 and 10. I think it's 3 verses later, right there in that same context. Paul says, as it was proclaimed by in the Old Testament, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And Lord there in that context, quoted by Paul, is Jehovah. So let me say it again. Romans 10:9. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God's raised him from the dead, you'll be saved. And then Paul says, it's just like it says in the Old Testament, whoever calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. And that use of Lord, that second use of Lord is in caps. Paul defines which Lord. You said it right. Lord can mean sir. Lord can mean master. But Paul quotes the verse where it's Jehovah. Now, I'm not going to let everything rest on Romans 10:9, but I think that's pretty instructive. If you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord, and it's like Paul saying, and by the way, by Lord, I mean Jehovah. So it's right there. Here's some more. Philippians chapter 2, which is often called the Christological hymn. We are told that Jesus came from everlasting. He's pre-existent. And at the beginning of Philippians 2, 6 through 11, which is a creed, it says this: Jesus was in the form of God. Now, form doesn't mean much to us in English. Form might be a roughed-in house where the 2x4, the frame is up. That's form. But I can't live there, and when it starts raining, I get wet. So that's just a form. But in Greek, the primary meaning of form, morphe, is nature. The same nature of. And in Philippians chapter 2, 6 through 11, it starts out, he was in the form of God. Next verse, he was in the form of a servant. And that's where we get this God and man. You go, that's a pretty advanced doctrine, isn't it? It is, but why is it in the early creed in Philippians chapter 2? So you got Romans 10:9, Lord, Philippians 2, pre-existent, and he's of the nature of God. And guess what? Every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. He's sharing God's throne. So you get these verses right from the beginning. He's Lord. Romans 1, 3, and 4. He showed himself by the resurrection to be Son of God, Messiah, and Lord. That's Romans 1, 3, and 4, another creed. So they're using these terms in these early creeds. Now, this is stage 2. The first stage is they preached it. The second stage is the preaching becomes crystallized. And the crystallization is called creeds. The people whoever has not heard me speak on creeds before, any of your folks, we do the same thing in school today. Somebody could be illiterate, and you could teach a kindergarten who can't spell their name, or a preschooler, you can teach them, row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Or we can teach them, Jack and Jill went up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Those are little statements that have a da 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 ring to them. And we do that so that potentially people who can't sign their name, can't read, are tracking with you. We sing hymns. How about, here's a Christian example of Jack and Jill or row, row, row your boat. How about We could say on a hill far away was an old rugged cross. We could say, um,
How about just the
uh,
ABCs? My son, I think he was at like 2 years old when he learned his ABCs, and that's
there
another
you
one of those
go.
that does.
When my son was 2, he was putting together a map of the United States on a little where you put the states in.
Oh,
Now, those are great
nice.
examples. Those are great examples because they're not row, row, row your boat and Jack and Jill. They're showing they know what's going on by putting states in or by saying A, B, C, D, but he can't read a book. So we're giving them the building blocks, right? The
Well, it's
creeds
very
were early.
formulaic. That's the way that I think about it. Is that it's formulaic, and I think like if you have enough repetition, you can get someone to remember a formula.
There you go. And you don't have to read to sing "Amazing Grace, how sweet
Yeah.
the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was blind, but," and there's a dot 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 dot.
So
All right, let me
before we
flip
move on,
here.
give me those.
Yep.
What are the creeds? What are all the creeds? The exact references. I actually want to go look at these after
Okay.
the
Yeah,
show.
I'll give you a number of them. Romans 1, 3, and 4. Romans 4:25. Romans 10:9. 1 Corinthians 11 on the communion passage. I gave you that which I also received from the Lord. The same night which he was betrayed, took bread, he blessed it, gave thanks, broke it, gave thanks. That's 1 Corinthians 11. 1 Corinthians 15 is the best known one and probably the earliest. And he says there, I gave you which I was given, how Christ, and he defines the gospel. Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, was buried, rose again the third day according to scripture, and appeared to Peter and the 12. And here comes these 5 appearances. And Paul says, last of all, he appeared to me. So 1 Corinthians 15 is the main one. Philippians chapter 2 is major. Here's another one, a
What
very
verse is
obscure
that one?
one.
2 what?
Which one?
For Philippians 2 verse what?
1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 to 7. Especially
Philippians?
3, 4, 5.
Sorry, I'm
But
asking
6 and
about
7.
Philippians.
Oh, 2, 6 to 11.
Philippians 2, 6 through 11. Okay.
6 for 11. Now, a very
And
obscure
what's the other
one,
one?
but a very heavy one, is Hebrews 1, 3. It says that Jesus was the same nature as God. But so does Philippians 2, 6 say that.
But
So you
we
got
don't. I
2
mean,
verses.
Hebrews was not written by Paul, unless do you think that it was?
No, but here's the point. It does make a difference. These books are going to be later. Let's say Hebrews was 75 AD. That's not the point. The point is, when did Hebrews 1, 3 come? Because the creeds are way
When did the
earlier in the
creed come?
books in
Okay.
which they appear.
Right.
So
Okay.
let me go back to Romans. Everyone's familiar with Romans 10:9, Romans
hmm
1, 3, and 4. You go, well, yeah, but Romans is probably 54 to 58 AD. Yeah, but
By
that's not what I'm
Romans 1,
asking.
3,
Well, what are you asking?
by Romans 1, 3, and 4, you mean chapter 1, verse 3 through 4?
Yeah, 1
Okay.
verses 3 to 4, Romans 10:9. And you go, well,
Got it.
that book's written 54 to 58. You're going backwards because you said Thessalonians was 50 and this is now 58. Now go, time out, time out. We're not talking about the books. They can't be any later in the books because they're in the books, but the creeds are earlier, and we haven't answered the how early
Right.
question yet. I'll do that right
Okay.
now. Bart Ehrman, best known skeptic in North America, probably in the world, atheist New Testament scholar. And he said, now you're not going to get this in one comment. He gives us some little tiny half comments, and you got to string them all together. But he said all of them. Here's what he says. Bart Ehrman says, the creeds, all or most of them originated in Jerusalem. That's important because that's the birth of the church or where the apostles were. Remember, we're looking for early eyewitnesses. They originated in Jerusalem. They came out immediately. Some of them were only 1 to 2 years after the cross. That's Bart Ehrman. Some of them were only 1 to 2 years after the cross. And you got to be ready for this one, Cam. 1 to 2 years after the cross, they could have all been in existence before Paul took his journey to Damascus. If you let that sink in, you start to see why the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. So
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely see that,
so far
especially if we're getting all of these creeds that they espouse a high Christology. That's what the creeds do. And then if you date them early,
Yep.
then it seems pretty obvious to say that that's a really obvious catalyst. That's a really easy way of saying that, like, this would be a very good reason for someone like Paul to go out and start trying to, capture these Christians and persecute them. Whatever terminology you want to use, that's not really relevant. But the point is that, yeah, if you've got a high Christology during that time, it really makes sense of what he was doing, the work that he was doing against Christians before his conversion.
Right. Now you're getting it. I'm doing 5 here, but I still haven't answered this question. Where was the fuse that shot this all out? All 5 of these? How did they come shooting out of the cannon at one time? I got to still answer that. But okay, so far we've got homologia. This is the earliest message they gave. By the way, of the dozens of early creeds in the epistles, of the dozens, about 80% of them say over and over again, deity, death, resurrection, deity, death, resurrection, deity, death, or maybe just one of them, deity. Next one says resurrection, but they're usually all there. Deity, death, resurrection. That's the message that came out of the canon in 30 AD. Deity, death, resurrection. That's the main thing. And I'm unpacking 5 ways they did it. First one is a homologia, and that's what Garrett Ludeman says is the Christians were only telling their story in the marketplace and everywhere else. They were preaching. That's a homologia. And the message is always the same, deity, death, resurrection, because homologia means earliest thing we shared and believed among us. Next, if I'm preaching this for a long time and I'm taking it to the marketplace, I'm taking it to work, I'm taking it to school, I'm going everywhere, but up to 90% of Jesus's crowd, it's estimated, up to 90% of his crowd was illiterate. Well, they heard him, and they heard Peter, but they wanted to go home with this message, and they already forgot it by the time they got to the house. That's when the creeds come up. That's stage 2. And people do the da form. Jack and Jill went up the hill, row, row your boat. They do those things. Or your son learned the ABCs. That's great because those are the building blocks for writing. So these, if you want people to remember them, you have to put them in form they can remember. That's the creeds. That's number 2. But let me just say, Bart Ehrman thinks they dated from the cross. Some of them are as early as 1 to 2 years. Many of them are in the 30s. And they're flooding the field with these little quoted lines. And he says possibly every one that Paul quoted could have been in existence before he said goodbye and took his trip to Damascus. So they were all there. And Paul probably knew them. This is just a little aside insight. Paul probably knew them, and it's probably why he was ticked. He thought all this was heresy. So, okay, so far we've got earliest preaching. They did it in the creeds. Okay, number 3. Somewhere right in here.
Well, let me stop real quick because I'm still having trouble understanding this first one. The second one makes a whole lot of sense. The creeds are early and everything. Homologia, explain that one more time. How is that evidence of the high Christology in the early period?
Because the homologia is if you were to hear a Christian in the marketplace who gets everybody's attention and starts preaching, or in an early quote-unquote house church, or being witnessed to at work, that's the message you'd hear them say over and over again. Remember, the creeds aren't around yet. But 80% of those early messages were about the gospel. And of course, the New Testament says it over and over again. The primary Christian preaching was the gospel. This man that you killed is the Son of God who did all these things. It was just plain preaching. The word was getting out there just by preaching everywhere. It became solidified just a little bit more when the creeds crystallized it.
Well, how do we know that the preaching back then was of a high Christology? Or is that not the point? Am I missing the point?
Well, because our earliest recollection of it, the preaching of it, they tell us what they're preaching. And if you need more than that, the second stage, the creeds, that's what we're calling high Christology, is what the creeds are proclaiming. Let me say it again.
See, that's kind of what I was getting at, was maybe there's like an overlap between those first two.
Well, yeah, there is. The first one is what they said. It's sort of like this. You're saying something in school. You're a student, and you're saying something in school, and you're just talking, and you've mesmerized the teacher, and the teacher says, "Put it in writing for me." And the next day you come with a couple paragraphs, and you've written up what you were trying to get across in class. It's the same message, but now it's formalized. First, it was preached without a basis. Second step, it's formalized in creeds. Same message, though. Same message, but it's a lot
I
more
see.
solid in step 2. All right,
Okay.
somewhere in there, probably during the homologia, probably in that stage, but somewhere in these first 2 stages, James, the brother of Jesus, comes to know Jesus. According to the New Testament, he was in the upper room with Mary and his other brothers. You know that John chapter 7, Mark 3, and Mark 6 all say that Jesus' brothers were unbelievers. In fact, John 7:5 says it directly. His brothers did not believe in him. It's worse in Mark 3 because they thought he was nuts. If you go back and look at the Greek, they thought he was beside himself. And they apparently tried to drag him out from front of the crowds because they thought he was giving their family and their city a bad name. So they weren't believers. Somewhere in here, James becomes a Christian. Now, you may not have heard this before, but from 1 Corinthians 15, we know he appeared to James, right? He appeared to Peter, to James. We have 2 individuals and 3 groups in that creed of 1 Corinthians 15. But all we have is that comment, he appeared to James. That's all we have in the New Testament. Now some fragments have been discovered. They're not New Testament. They're not inspired. But it's a little book that may only be 25 years after the Gospel of John. It's really early. And it's called the Gospel of the Hebrews. And it only exists in a few fragments. Guess what one of the fragments is? Jesus appearing to his brother James. This is really cool. And it's sort of like the 2
When did we
pretty
find
deep
this?
ones. I don't know where it was found, but it's in existence. You can get it online. If you look up the Gospel of the Hebrews, you can get the fragments. And one of them is like the disciples at Emmaus. Jesus is breaking bread with his brother. It's really cool. It's very brief. But Jesus is standing there with his brother thinking, man, would I like to be a fly on the wall. But the third step that happens is somewhere in there, probably back during the homologia. I should have said it during the homologia, then gone to the creeds. So really, if I had to do that over, I'd say the homologia, what they preach is number 1. James, during that same time, simultaneous, James comes to the Lord by resurrection appearance. Third, the homologia is getting stratified. And according to Bart Ehrman, it was all there. This part it modifies Bauckham saying the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. Well, according to Bauckham, according to Bart Ehrman, all the creeds Paul cited could possibly have been in existence. Paul cites him as a Christian later, but they could have been in existence prior to his leaving home to walk to Jerusalem or ride or whatever he did to Jerusalem. So you got the homologia, it's simply the marketplace message. James is converted during that time. According to Acts 1, he's in the upper room with Mary and the brothers. What's he doing up there? And here's another question for you. Why did Jesus give his mother to John at the cross and not to James? It just
Why
an
did she do what?
implication.
Ask that question
Why
one more
did
time.
Jesus give Mary to John to take care of instead of to James, his brother? It's just a hint, but it might be a hint that James wasn't in the fold yet. It's going to happen pretty quickly, a few days, but James isn't in the fold yet. And so the message is preached. James becomes a believer because he meets Jesus, and these creeds are starting to pour out. And before Paul even takes his walk to Damascus at +2 or +3, Paul knows all these creeds, and he is ticked because it's heresy. But he meets the risen Jesus. That's step 4. Paul meets Jesus on the road to Damascus. So now we have 4 levels. The homologia, you go, well, all you're doing is preaching. Great. Now just keep coming here. Preaching. Secondly, James is converted. Thirdly, the creeds spring up. Paul's ticked. He leaves for Damascus now we're only +2 or +3, and Paul is converted. That's the 4th one. And the 5th one, Bart Ehrman says this may be the biggest argument in the early church for proving who Jesus is. Paul goes to Jerusalem. Do you remember Galatians chapter 1, which critics accept? Galatians is a book you can preach. Paul goes to Jerusalem, and he meets with Peter and James for 15 days, Galatians 1:15 and following. And a little Greek word there is hysteresi. With the little part of it is the root word, Histor, when you transliterate. It's the Greek word from which we get our word history. It's usually said, often said, what Paul was doing was interviewing. That's what the word means. He's doing research. He's a Pharisee. He knew how to do research. Josephus tells us that. He's interviewing Peter and John. Now, if I'm Paul, here's my first question. Guys, I'll tell you what Jesus looked like when I saw him on the road to Damascus if you tell me what, after Black Saturday and you all thought your world had ended, if you tell me what it looked like when you first saw Jesus on Resurrection Sunday. I mean, the whole book of Galatians is about the gospel. Don't make it too big, it's heresy. Don't make it too small, it's heresy. Get it right. Paul could not have gone there. Even the critics say this. Paul could not have gone there for 15 days and not discuss the gospel with the other two eyewitnesses. And Bart Ehrman asked the question, where do we get closer to the eyewitnesses than right here in that meeting? It's either 35 or 36 AD, depending on where you put Paul's conversion. If Paul was converted in +2, that meeting is 35. Paul said 3 years later after my conversion, I went to Jerusalem. If he's converted 3 years later, now it's +6. The only thing, that's step 5. That's 5. You put them all together, here's what you get again. Earliest preaching that was just hearsay for the time being, but it's got started right at the beginning. Number 2, James comes to the Lord by a resurrection appearance. Number 3, the creeds begin, and they are bombastic. Jesus existed before he was born. He received every knee will bow, every tongue will confess. He was worshipped. He sat on the right hand of God. He shared the nature of God. Philippians 2:6, Hebrews 1:3. He shared the nature of God. These things were bombastic. Paul hated them, and that's why he was imprisoning them. Number 3, in response to the creeds, Paul takes off to Damascus, and he meets the risen Jesus. That's 4. And 5, 3 years later, he confirms this message with Peter and James, the eyewitnesses. So we started by saying, in order to do good history, you need early and eyewitnesses. That's the best possible thing you can have. Early eyewitnesses. And Paul's going to Jerusalem. You've got them all here. The homologia, James's conversion, which is cemented, by the way, in the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. So, homologia, James's conversion, the creeds, Paul's conversion, and 3 years later, he spends 15 days with Peter and James. Now, he went back there. It was 14 years later, but still before the book of 1 Thessalonians. He goes back 14 years later, and in Galatians 2:2, he laid before the other apostles the gospel he was preaching, and to see if he was preaching the right gospel. And who's there? Peter, James, and now John is there. The big 4, and I don't count that second meeting because it was 14 years later. It gets me outside my 6 years later. But 14 years later, the big 4 are together, and they agreed on the definition of the gospel. Don't forget, 80% of the creeds, death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. So that's the 6. Now, the only thing we haven't done, according to my watch, we still got 7 minutes. We'll get there by our hour. But here's the canon. What was the wick that they lit to shoot this stuff out? The answer is, and it's in the creeds, the answer is the resurrection. Jesus is saying all these things. You'll know it when I'm raised from the dead. I'm going to go up to Jerusalem. I'm going to die. I'm going to be raised. And Peter goes, not on my watch, you're not. I'm bringing a sword. And he cuts the guy's ear off. I mean, they didn't get the point, but they heard the preaching. It's all the resurrection. It's all the resurrection. It's all the resurrection. The angels at the tomb say, you're going to see him. Tell the women, you're going to see him. They heard these things before Jesus died, but they didn't realize them till he was raised from the dead. And that's when the wick was lit, when he was raised. And that's why the Christology was so explosive right from the very beginning. That's why the earliest Christology was the highest Christology. Does that make sense?
So I think you would still put this in terms of like, this is still just evidence, right? It's not any kind of like 100% proof of the resurrection. This is just some evidence in favor of it.
No, none of the sciences, either the hard sciences or the soft sciences like history, psychology, sociology, anthropology. Neither the hard sciences nor the soft sciences, they don't produce proof. They can only produce probability. That's how biology works. That's how history works. So yes, if your comment is this is just a probable argument, I'd say, really, just a probable argument? What do you do when you tell me another religion, another history, another anything where there's 5 backups in the first 6 years? Yeah, Mark's great at plus 40. Something's going on in First Thessalonians at plus 20 because he's using all this high Christological language, and everyone's going, no one's going, come again, Paul, we don't even know what these words mean. They already knew it, so it had been out there and about before 50 AD. So it was out there. But that phrase, the earliest Christology that we started with, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. It's because it all clicked when the canon of the resurrection went off, and they said, oh my gosh, he's the Son of God. And somebody else goes, he's the Lord of the Old Testament. And somebody else goes, he should be worshiped. And somebody else goes, he's seated at the right hand of God. He said so himself before the high priest. I thought it was just a metaphor, but it really happened. Because, see, it's all kind of a metaphor until the shot of the cannon, which of the resurrection, which is utterly unique, and it gave shoe leather to all 5 of these. And there's no message like this. Here, I'll tell you this one. Paul Barnett, an Australian historian, said, no figure in the ancient world has this much of early evidence in their earliest projected life after they lived. No other figure in history has this amount of evidence.
We got about 3 minutes left, and we had a super chat that was sent in a while ago from Cranman Photo Cinema. He says, Gary, can you say Da Bears?
Da Bears, what's that mean? Is that the Chicago Bears?
Yeah, it's the Chicago Bears, but it's from a SNL skit, I think, from years ago with Chris Farley.
Oh, I don't know.
Da
All I know
Bears.
is I'm a Green Bay Packer fan, and I'm embarrassed because we lost that game when we were the favorite team in the NFL.
Oh,
but
goodness, yeah.
I know they beat the Bears, so.
Yeah, he's it's your accent. He was trying to play off your accent. It's I just wanted to put that on the screen. I saw that earlier.
Yeah, do I sound like I have an accent to you?
You got a little bit. You got a little one. Yeah.
I'm from Detroit. The answer from Detroiters is, we don't have an accent because when they do the 6 o'clock national news out of Chicago, nobody sounds to us like they have accents. So that must be the national accent. That's
Yeah.
what they always say. The national news sounds like us.
That's it. Have you been watching any of the Olympics? This is completely off topic. Have you been watching any of the Olympics, the Winter Olympics?
I'm not. I don't have any time. I'm doing this MO, and my first volume is due in March, and I'm working my head off. I'm working 80 hours a week. I haven't stopped for years. 80 hours a week. What do you think about those 5 as being shot out of the cannon? And, I mean, you said you've been anticipating this for a long time. We didn't unpack as much as we could have, but there are these kind of, they're not proof, but are they kind of stunning in how they all fit together?
Yes. So my assessment off the cuff of what I just heard, and still processing it, obviously I've got to it's going to take some time to really think about it clearly. But the creedal part is the part that really stands out to me, are the high Christology that you find in the very early creeds. And that's another thing that a lot of these scholars, Bart Ehrman, I don't know who else, you would probably know, but a lot of these guys date these creeds really, really early, back to the very early church. And that's what really sticks out to me, is that high Christology that's there in these early creeds. And then what
about James and Paul becoming Christians, which puts the shoe leather on the creeds?
Yeah, and so Paul, that is because he was preaching the creeds, after his conversion. So that's interesting. It's very interesting to think about the connection there.
We haven't talked about Romans 1, 3, and 4, but Romans 1, 3, and 4, it says he was shown to be Messiah, Son of God, and Lord by virtue of his resurrection. So what I mean is the creed in Romans 1, 3, and 4 says that the impetus, the canon, was the resurrection. There's a creed that says it was all shot out of a cannon, and that cannon was the resurrection.
And that creed is basically your argument. Okay.
Well, yeah, what we're saying is All this was just a teaching that people didn't know what to do with until he was raised from the dead, and then it came together quickly. That's why they started preaching the message immediately.
Okay, I think that's going to do it on our time. You've got other things to do. I've got other things to do, but this has been really, really great. I want you to let me know what you think in the comments. If this has been interesting to you, if it hasn't been interesting, if you think that this is all just wrong, then let me know in the comments. I really do appreciate you taking time to make comments below. So, but Gary, thanks again for coming on. It's always a pleasure, and we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally,